see this coming home again. This is extremely strange. Original castings, they were never
Right from the blast
damaged.
furnace.
I did take the liberty of putting left and right because
Yeah.
early on with stoves, everything was hand fitted by the molder. They weren't mass producing it, so every blessed thing had to be all done individually. So each one of these legs is individual to a side of the stove and also on the front as well. So that's the rear legs. Very strange to see those on later stoves. This is one of the things that we look for in trying to identify a time period. There's the original front legs as well, and notice how dainty those are. Just astonishing. How are you?
Make an older man than I want to be.
So, that's great. We'll just put these in.
Oh, they just slide right
They
in.
slide right in, and that's why they're so individualized. The molders had to actually
Yeah.
fit each one to the casting. Okay.
Pretty clever the way they slide right in there.
Well, these were designed as what they call portable ranges. So you would use these either, depending on what kind of hearth you had. If you had an enormous hearth, like the early New England homes, you'd actually slide this right into the hearth and you could use it in that capacity. But in the off-season, in the summer months, it would go outside into a lean-to or an outdoor kitchen, and then you
Oh.
wouldn't be heating up the house. This piece, I'm astonished, was with the stove. This is, it's a draft control that slides in. It actually miters into a casting down below. And if one were to slide this, you can see there's only holes in here to admit the oxygen, which comes in this way, and then of course up through the holes to make the fire burn faster. This is not seen generally on stoves, in particular step stoves. Usually, there was just a draft plate here, which would be slid back and then in for fire control. This stove had two, and the fact that it had two really got us wondering, because we've just never seen that before. And then that's when we realized there was a cooking hole directly over what normally would be just the ash pit. And there's also a partition in between. And that's when it occurred to us, wait a minute, this is another combustion chamber. And then after looking at some of the accessories for later ranges, we realized this is almost identical to the removable summer cookers for ranges from a later date. So this maker actually incorporated a summer cooker right into the stove.
Do you think maybe that was part of the patent?
It could well be, and I'll bet it can be referenced if the information is available. But the fact that there's a controllable draft down below on what, like I normally said, would be the ash reservoir, it didn't make any sense until we realized that this removable hole was indeed another fire area for small fires. And the benefit of that is you could heat up just this area, do your cooking very quickly, the smoke would still issue up the flue, but you wouldn't be hindered by any heat in the home in the summer months. So amazing, amazing,
So that little
amazing
chamber
piece.
held a fire right below your
It
here?
held a fire if you choose. Now above, normally, would be the firebox area.
Okay.
That can be fed with wood right through here.
Oh, yeah.
So that would be considered the primary firebox, but indeed, this stove does have a secondary firebox for small fires down below this
So you
single
would use
cooking bowl.
practically kindling for that fire?
Precisely, or even coals that had already reduced the charcoal.
Oh,
from
yeah,
the
that's
fire,
right.
and you could just kindle that quickly and then it would go out. Truly, truly, truly unique to see that feature in a range. It's extraordinary, a real privilege to be able to find one. I need a special area over here for stuff. This little door is a clean out, and the clean out just slides into the back of the stove. And what would happen over time as the stove was used, is ash would build up under the oven, and as that ash accumulated, it would eventually restrict the flow of the hot gases. So consequently, once in a while, one would have to clean out under the oven. And that's what this little clean out tool is for. It's a small, very similar to a garden hoe on a small scale. And you could remove that little gate there and reach in with the little ash hoe and pull out all of the accumulated ash, and then of course the stove would run as it would have when you initially purchased it. So neat to see that tool with the stove as well. This is a relatively early griddle. It did not initially come with the stove, but based on the heart-shaped casting pattern in the handle, it is indicative of the time period, and it happened to fit the summer cooker spot. So I did include this with the range, and of course one can remove that lid and then place in the griddle as well. So it would demonstrate beautifully how they could use the griddle down in the summer cooker position. So that will be there. I've included a shallow griddle. Griddles, of course, were used for anything from Johnny cakes to, meats and whatnot, whatever one was cooking. This oval griddle could be used in two different capacities. It could be used just sitting right on top of the existing stove surface, or one could remove several lids. And this is what's so unique about this cookware in this stove. You never see these protrusions on both sides to block what's called the center. This is what's called a center on a stove. And they actually reach out a little bit beyond the round lids, the round covers. So when you remove that, you would otherwise, with another type of griddle, get smoke into the home. This particular griddle actually has little stoppers on there. So when you place this on the stove, you don't get any smoke issuing into the house. It's a size 6. That is excruciatingly hard to find. I mean, people can look a lifetime and never find a number 6 griddle for a stove. And the fact that this one surfaced and it had the correct wings on it, and it is of the right time period based on the castings and the finish of the metal. Although I can't say that it was initially supplied from this company, I can say wholeheartedly that it was made for a stove of this genre, of this age, certainly in New England. And could it well possibly have come from that foundry? Absolutely. I mean, it is a dead ringer fit with no alterations. I've also included what's called a deep griddle. Deep griddles could be used again just on the top, or you could remove other cooking lids. People would do anything in here from roasting with a tin cover over the top, or they also would do deep fat frying. I mean, even Franklin referenced deep fat frying at one point, so you certainly could do that kind of work in a griddle like this. So it's nice to see, again, in size 6, the deep griddle for a range. I think the favorite piece for many folks who see this stove is this. And this is a waffle iron, again, in the super, super rare size 6. One could easily turn over the iron, but more so than that, patterns would vary in waffle irons, and usually you just see, squares or rectangles, occasionally diamonds. This particular one is what we refer to in the stove business as a gambler's waffle iron. And if one were to look closely at the designs in here, there are representations for hearts, diamonds, clubs, and spades for your waffles. So when you pull that out, you have that nice image on there. Put that right there.
I'm getting hungry already.
Just thinking about it.
Now, this particular stove is unique in so many ways. It's tough to discuss them all. But one of the things that's quite interesting about this range is it also was initially furnished with a roasting oven. So the reason for that is if we look at the actual, what I call the service oven, the oven that would be used every day, one can access that from both sides. And that oven is relatively small. I mean, you can see it's a small cavity. You could do baking in there and things of that nature. But if you had to actually roast fowls or a turkey or a duck or whatever that may be, maybe a ham, whatever that was, this oven wasn't going to cut it. So consequently, what a lot of folks don't realize is over time the tollware, the tin portions that initially were furnished with stoves are quite often just missing, and they rotted away, they were discarded, they got dented or dropped. Occasionally the solder would melt and they'd come apart. Those things have just been lost. This particular one has the tollware reflector oven. Now a lot of folks, when they see this, they say, oh, that's a fireplace oven. And unfortunately, in that case, they would be wrong. Fireplace reflector ovens are generally up on a wooden frame, and they sit a little bit higher. And range reflector ovens, or cook stoves in this case, always have little short feet. And the reason for that is the firebox was fed this way, so one could put the wood in here, but you also had doors that would open with a pretty grate behind it. And that actually was for the purpose of braising or roasting with your reflector oven. And as you can see, it is a perfect fit for the range. This oven basically has a skewer in it, and one would skewer the fowls or whatever meat you were going to cook on that particular day. And there are adjustable spots, so you could set and rotate the spit, as they call it, as needed. Notice also the fact that it has a rounded bottom and a little spigot, so any of the drippings and whatnot would get caught, and then you could pour off those drippings when you were done in order to save it.
Pretty good, huh?
This was quite a design. This one also has a tending door, so one didn't have to pull the oven down, risk spilling the drippings and all that stuff in order to baste the meat or whatever one had to do in order to check to see its progress as it was roasting. To find a tollware oven for a stove of this nature that's the right size, the right configuration, again, incredibly rare. So it's lovely to see one with the stove. And what you have here is almost the full workup of appropriate cookware. The last one would be a kettle from that time period as well. This kettle is a little large for this range, but I chose to include it because it does have the wrought handle, it does have the early gate mark pouring spout, and it does have the indented bottom so one could sit it through a stove lid for direct heat on the fire. This particular kettle, I did not find a cover for it, so unfortunately it is going to be coverless for now. But nevertheless, I did want to include it with the stove because it's very indicative of the time period in which this was made. So you have that as well. Questions, comments, concerns?
So the flue from that would go up through the fireplace or up through its own?
If it were a large hearth in a home that had like a walk-in hearth, an early colonial home, indeed they would put the funnel, is what they called it, right up the flue. In other cases, a home of this age, there would be a designated flue for that. And interestingly enough, there is a book called Fire on the Hearth, written by Josephine Pierce in 1951. And that book says several things in regard to stovepipe. And one of the things is that stovepipe quite often was more expensive than the stove itself. So pretty.
Why is that? It was just made of tin, right?
It was tin, but there was no way to work it, so it was all handwork. And then they
Oh,
didn't
I
have
see.
the machines that make the Reeves lock or a Pittsburgh
Yeah.
fold. So consequently, all that had to be done, and generally hand pinned. So they'd have to punch a hole in it, take a little piece of iron, stick it through, peen it over on both sides, both the inside and the out, and they do that every several inches. So you can
Oh, yeah.
imagine that it was quite an undertaking just to make one piece. And then you get into things like elbows with crazy miters,
Yeah.
and they have to do lock seams by hand on those elbows at 90 degrees. It was a very difficult thing.
How was this stove made at that time? Was there a mold for it that they could have made more than one?
That's a great question. Yeah, quite often patterns were made out of wood initially. So someone would have made the patterns first. Probably Mr. Fuller, unless he had an employee underneath him that was doing this, would generate all the patterns in wood, fit them, and once everything was fitted and appropriately ready to go, it would be sent to the molders. The molders would then use that wooden pattern from there and remove the wood, of course, from the sand molds, and then they would pour the iron in, and you would get the individual stove plates or the stove covers or whatever they were making at that time period. I did include a lifter. This is a lifter that's right in the general time period of the stove. It does have the ability to just lift the covers off, but more so than that, it also has a lifter for the bail on kettles, so you didn't have to burn your hands. You could come over to the stove, hook the bail, lift that, and then move the kettle to wherever one had to, and just take that off. So that's
Now, how
nice to
hot
see.
would this get? Would the iron surfaces ever start to glow red?
Occasionally, we do hear customers who say that today when they come to our shop. A stove should never glow red, unless it's a Russia iron stove. They made those a little bit later in the 1830s. But a cast iron stove should never glow red. That would be considered abuse to the stove. But did it happen? Certainly. Cold, windy nights when it was below zero and you've got a tremendous updraft, sometimes it's unavoidable.
Yeah, wow.
Where did the iron come from? Europe at that time?
It really depends. In New England, you know, stovepipe iron, Russia iron, was coming from overseas for sheet metal and things of that nature. But the iron that these stoves were made out of most probably was coming out of a local bog. And you'll hear about bog iron, and it's a long story, but the bacteria that live in the mud in bogs will actually eat certain things, and then whatever's with those things that they're eating also has iron attached to it, so the iron is then excreted. So wherever there's a spring in a bog, quite often there's a ring of iron nodules right around that. And it didn't take long for people in the New World to figure out very quickly that you could harvest this iron and then, of course, melt it down in the various furnaces, turn it into pig iron, and then from there the pigs would be sold to individual foundries who would mold it into whatever aspects they were going to make.
Now, this stove burned wood, is that correct?
This is a wood burner only, yes, and that's always indicative by the straight firebox with no real existence of a coal grate in there for shaking. So the wood would just burn away, and then of course once the ash turned to powder, it would just filter down through into the ash pit where it could be either shoveled out, so one would remove the cooking lid, slide this out, and then of course you could shovel out any of the ashes that had accumulated.
So the woman of the house would maintain the stove, right?
I would assume so. The stove would have been generally off limits to anyone except for the individual who was using it. And you know, at the time period, I mean, we look at this today as just an old iron stove, but when this was new and when this came to someone's household, this was an event. And this was really the peak of technology for domestic science in the 1830s. Up till this time period, people were still, and well after too, people were generally still using open hearths to cook. So consequently, when someone got a true dedicated cooking range in their home, it was a real event, and I can guarantee you the neighbors came over, or somebody came over after church to come view the stove.
So that means it must have gone for a good price then, huh?
Absolutely, and you know, it's tough to say what it cost at that time period. I mean, it probably was equivalent to, you know, several shillings or $1 or whatever they were using at that time period. But when you factor that in with inflation, at least with more modern stoves, stoves made in the 1920s, you know, they were selling for $40 and $50, and if you figure that out in terms of gold, today, when we sell a stove out of our shop, they're still selling for 2 ounces of gold, you know? So at the time period, I'm sure early on, if you figure out what the currency was at the time period, that this was a significant portion of one's income, and it was a real step to purchase a range and have that come home. And it also, at the time period, was not proven, so you were slightly odd if you showed up with a cooking range in your home at that time period. So this was a real event. And I wish it could tell stories, because what's happened around this range is just amazing, I'm sure.
They have to almost be on the floor to operate the stove, don't you? I mean,
They're very low.
yeah.
We see that right up through the 1850s until just about the Civil War. Around 1860, stoves started to get a little bit higher.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm not sure if it was due to the fact that it was very expensive to cast the metal at the time period, or if it's just the style that was in vogue, or it was low because it would fit in the hearth. I'm really not sure what that is is about, but I do know that by the time of the Civil War, stoves were starting to get taller, and of course it was becoming more in vogue to stand up when cooking rather than being bent over the stove.
So did that sit directly on a wooden floor without,
Generally,
Catching the house on
I mean,
fire?
it was either in the hearth, but you could have this on a wooden floor, and they look really low to the floor, but when you have oxygen passing through underneath the fire, it does tend to cool that area under the firebox, and there's ample space under here for circulation, so when we find these stoves, we find them backed right up to, matchboard walls, and they're this close to the stove, and no burn marks on the wall. Today, they have to make sure everything is pretty much idiot-proof, so there's codes and whatnot for everything. But at the time period when this was made, you were on your own. It was your house, it was your land, do with as you please. If you burn the house down, it's your own fault. So people consequently were quite careful in how they installed it, but generally they would sit on some kind of a stone hearth, particularly if it were backed into a fireplace, you already had that skirt on the floor. The one thing I want to talk about before I leave today is the fact that this is a genre of stove called a step stove. And you can see it very much resembles stairs. The initial step is the ash pit and summer cooker. Of course, this is the primary firebox and primary cooking area. This would be the hottest area of the stove. And then up above is the secondary cooking area, and this would be, of course, the next coolest area. So you'd be doing your simmering and stews and things up in this area, fast boiling down here. Anything along the lines of like what we would do with bacon today would be done in the primary cooking area because you had that hot instant heat that you could maintain. Notice I said in the beginning that this was a cook stove versus a cook range. This stove has an oven that can be accessed on both sides, and whenever you see that with ranges, that generally is referred to as a cook stove. And the thinking there was one didn't have to pull out the dishes that they were cooking at the time period to do basting. You could access the foods from both sides. So it just made it a little more convenient. And the stove actually would be oriented in this fashion with the flue closest to the wall. And then, of course, it was the easiest to walk around the stove and get to the various portions. There is an oven rack in the stove. Again, exceedingly rare to see an oven rack still with the stove originally. Even the stoves made in the 19-teens and the 1920s, they're always missing the oven rack. So the fact that this has survived is truly astonishing. This can be used on the floor of the oven, or it can be used in the center of the oven. On the floor of the oven would be used more along the lines for roasting, and then of course raised up above you'd be doing things that were more along the lines of like wheat cakes and things like that, so you wouldn't burn the bottoms. So fascinating to see the oven rack still
So
with
you-
the stove.
You didn't have any wood or kindling in the oven part yet? at the
No,
top?
no, this was
So
just
that was heated from the lower,
just a
middle?
baking area.
Yeah.
And that, I'm glad you asked that, because this particular stove is also unique on another level. This has two draft controls. This oven was designed, and this is way ahead of its time. We were floored when we saw this. I can't stress that to you enough. We were really blown away at how this was designed. The hot gases from the firebox can be directed initially right underneath the oven to heat the floor of the oven, and then the backside and out the flue, which would be for a baking capacity. But one can also direct the hot gases from the firebox over the top of the oven. So in other words, behind this plate, under the cooking area, and then out. So there's two reasons for that. One is if you needed more heat, of course, in the boiling area up above, you could direct the hot gases that way. But then we got thinking about it, and there's more than that. It also, like our stoves today with the broiling element up above, you could direct the hot gases over the top of the oven, and you also have a broiler at that point. So not only did the stove have a summer cooker, but it is a heated oven, and not only is it a heated oven, it's a heated broiler as well. Unheard of for stoves of this time period. We were
So a cook could become a what do you call it when you're really good at something, like a violin?
You could become quite,
Maestro or?
quite good.
Yeah, I mean, you could play it like an instrument, all these different
Sure.
options.
And as you learn over time, you know, there's one customer that we have today. who talks about roasting a chicken for a certain amount of time in the oven, and then at the very end throwing cedar shakes on top of the fire to just increase that temperature for the last 5 or 10 minutes,
Suppose you wanted biscuits to go with dinner.
just to brown the skin. So, there's all kinds of things one can do. Biscuits with dinner, if it was already pre-made and they had leavened and whatnot, then by all means, they could be
There'd be
slid,
room.
they could
Yeah.
be slid right in the oven at that point. So,
And if you wanted to cook some gravy, you could do that at the same
you can do
time?
that in this area or above. If it was the summertime, you might be in an open cauldron or right here on the summer cooker.
Oh, yeah.
Just amazing. So the draft, by the way, the summer cooker has a draft down below, but the draft for the main firebox on step stoves is generally controlled by pulling this out. And of course, the further out you go, the more oxygen can be administered to the fire and the faster it will go. The fact that this stove has the two, one down below and then of course the standard one up above, again, truly unique. And it's a term, like I said, people throw that term around. It's unique, it's different, it's rare. In this case, this is truly justified to use unique and rare for this stove. Unheard of, and it's a real credit to this area. with the
No
fact
wonder
that-
you got a patent
that
for it.
people were making these kinds of things right here. And it's just the kind of thing, if you were a smart person at that time period, it's just the kind of thing you would want to patent, because this
Yeah.
could well have been a substantial portion of your income at the time period.
So the Smithsonian does not have one of these?
They do not have one of these. Nobody has one of these. You do. That's it. Actually, it's the first thing found from this foundry. There may be items that are out there, but quite often toolware and cookware and any of that stuff was unmarked. Do I have a strong suspicion that those griddles may have come with this stove? Yeah, absolutely. Do I know that for a fact? No, I can't prove that. But the fact that this has L. Fuller's name on it so prominently, it's obvious that they were very proud of it. And it's a testament to how durable the stove was. It's 178 years old. So, by all means, if you have any more questions,
I
let me
think
know.
it's also a testament to your ability to renovate this stove,
Well, thank you.
considering the condition it was in when it
Yeah,
started.
this was not.
This is a magnificent renovation job.
Well, thank you, I appreciate that. This was not in the best of condition. This was missing. Initially, that was missing. That is an original. There was one or two present covers initially with the stove, and the rest were missing. So consequently, we did use those as a mold and replicate two more. One of the oven doors was partially present, and the other one was complete. Luckily, Mr. Fuller, again, was very smart, and he realized, why make two patterns when you could just flip one over? So we used the existing oven door and replaced one of the sides. I'm not sure which one. It was a perfect replication. So
So you do
stove-
casting down at your place?
well, we send that out.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, there's a certain amount of environmental concern with casting, so you have to send it
Do you
to
make the
us.
patterns for the casting?
We have made quite a few patterns, but in
Yeah.
this case, this particular stove came with just enough where we could use an existing portion of the stove in order to replicate the other pieces. So we lucked out. We lucked out. But
Now we lucked out.
Truly, truly a gem.
So who works with you?
I work with my dad, Emery Pinio, at the Antique Stove Hospital, and my name is Brandon. And I used to be an educator, but I like working with my hands, so I chose to continue the trade and go from there. And you
So
know,
he has a lot of experience
so-
with casting and
yeah,
iron?
oh,
working in
absolutely. He's done that since 1970, and I've done it basically all my life. When you grow up with it, you know,
Yeah.
you work with it every day. So that's the range.
Thank you.
And
Thank you
it's
so
a
much.
Lovely, lovely addition to your collection.